These are good. All right, so here's what like you get this too. When it comes to like laws or rules, or some of these things, like there are things that we would certainly cancel. Like there are things that like I wish were different. I think the pillow tag thing, I really do. I told Angie, our video director, I was telling her earlier, it was her idea, and I was like, I do it, but I feel guilty every time for about 11 seconds when I do that, right? Like there are certain things that I would certainly cancel. And we've kind of kicked off this series talking about the things that we would cancel, which is interesting, but the other part about this too is there are certain people who treat some like laws in particular that they're just going to do them. They've canceled them anyway. They're just going to move forward and kind of do what they want. Now, what's fascinating about our culture, and I think even philosophically even deeper, is oftentimes you'll hear things like my truth, right? This is my truth. It's my truth, whatever that is. And what's fascinating is that really works to an extent until it's something that culturally a lot of people disagree with, and then your truth can get canceled real quick with a bunch of people who are angry on Twitter. You ever seen this? Or what's the other fascinating is if you are the one who is kind of the full judgment of morality, right? If there's a piece of that, then you've seen this. People drift into this at certain points and then migrate and navigate towards making decisions that might be harmful to them or harmful to other people, but at the end of the day, they probably feel okay about it. Now, the movie theater one is one of my favorite ones because that's a great thing. When we looked around this room and you saw it, I mean, everybody but Noah does this. And Noah might be Jesus. I don't know. Like, he's one of the nicest people in the planet. Like, I love this guy. Like, he's amazing. Now, here's what's so interesting, though. And it's a great example, and you know this, it's a great example of how most of us have certain things that we're willing to kind of bend the rules or break the rules on at some point because we don't agree with it. Now, what's interesting about our culture is a lot of times this bubbles up to certain things that we obviously all kind of disagree with, or certain things that people do that obviously make us go, that's wrong, that shouldn't be that way in the world, that hurts somebody else, those kinds of things, right? You don't care so much about AMC as a corporation, you just want your Skittles. There's a little bit of that. But on the back end of this, there are ways that this bubbles up because this idea is inside all of us. And what often happens in our culture, and you've seen this, is people will do things and end up getting canceled. Now, I defined this last week. You don't really need a definition for it, but just so that we're all on the same page, we say it this way. That cancel culture is the movement of stripping someone of their credibility and our reputation while publicly humiliating them, right? Now, I got this definition from, what did I say? UrbanDictionary.com, so it's obviously real. It's good. But there's a piece of this that I was like, that actually encapsulates it really well. Like this thing of like, we just kind of end people's reputations. Or in some ways, we try to end the future opportunities that they might have for certain things. Now, I said this last week, and I still think it's deeply true of most of us in the room. But the truth of the matter is that I have the capability in me, no matter what I think about other people canceling other people, I have the capacity, right, to shame others while comparing others' worst moment to my best, right? And here's the thing what social media did. We talked about this a lot last week. Is social media gave us the opportunity to film it. Social media gave us the opportunity to put it out there in a mass sort of, distribution kind of way. It also gave us the opportunity to like and share and be a part of things in a communal base where we could stand against other people and be in a different category as other people, right? It gave us a unique opportunity to do this. It hasn't been present. We were talking earlier about Woodstock. This wasn't the case at Woodstock. Now, some of you around during that time, if people knew what you did at Woodstock, you know what I'm talking about? Like, it would be different. There's a little bit of these things that come along where you go, like, it's a different culture and a different posture. Now, the other part about this, and then we'll jump into today's talk. The other part that we said last week that I think is true of most of us and is descriptive of a lot of our culture is when I feel distant from somebody else, or I kind of want someone else to be canceled, or someone else does something that I deeply disagree with, whether it be a celebrity, a politician, or a crazy uncle, right? There's a part of me that has a default posture in those moments towards anger, frustration. I find myself like battle ready for these things. I can be sarcastic and cutting in these moments, and I can gear up for it. Some of you know this. Has anybody ever used like a gotcha phrase on you? You know what I'm talking about? Like it was half true, but it ended the conversation, right? I can be battle ready for those things. I can be hostile, contentious. And at the end of the day, Taylor Swift said it so well, I can just be mean, I just be mean. I can be mean to people that I feel slightly better than. And there's a part of my head, there's a part of my brain that allows me to go to the place that go, I would never, ever do that. But here's the truth, and you know this. For everybody who raised their hand to say that you would sneak Skittles into a movie theater, The thing in you that says, I will buck whatever that thing is with rules or laws, those kinds of things. It exists in everybody but Noah, right? That's good. All right, I'm done. All right, now here's where we're going to go today. I'm going to ask you a question in a second. I'm going to put both of these up here. Some of you have different bents, though, right? Some of you bend more towards one side than the other. Some of you are very, very focused on justice. Some of you are very, very focused on grace. And so I'm going to put these up here real quick. We put these up here. These are not like you got to be one or the other, but oftentimes they exist towards a bend, right? So we have a lot of people that are focused on grace, right? Especially when we talk about religion or politics, these kinds of things. People are focused on grace, and there are people who would say they're focused on truth. So let me just ask you real quick. Obviously you're not just one or the other, but if you were going to bend one way or the other, how many of you in the room, be honest, would say like you bend towards the grace side of things? You're more of like a grace-filled person. Yeah, these hands go up a little bit slower than the truth ones. I get it. Yeah, there's a little bit, yeah. Now, how many of you would say like you bend a little bit harder towards the truth, justice, and the American way, or whatever that is? You know what I mean? Yeah, you get it. Okay, you get it. And how many of you go, I don't want to answer your question in front of people? Anybody? Yeah, that's great. So look at it. Now, you think about this, a lot of times, and this is hard to talk about, but it's really honest, when we characterize these two things, or if we were going to really like kind of talk about these in that way, we have very specific ways that we think about it. We think about grace as being soft and truth as being harsh, right? We think about grace like this a little bit more. And we think about truth a little bit more like I have a specific set of skills. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, some of you are here and you're sitting next to one or the other and you're like laughing awkwardly, but like it's you. It's you, it's not me. Yeah, there's a little bit of this. Now, here's what's so fascinating. Now, this is what's so interesting. Depending on which one of these you've been towards, right? Christianity and people who talk about Christianity and churches actually have bents as well, right? And a lot of the ways that we talk about Jesus are focused on like this, right? He's a real good-looking white dude that holds lambs and smiles and hugs things a lot. You know what I'm talking about? You know what I mean? Like he has great hair product. And he's just like, and a lot of pictures with Jesus like holding like the little children, and it's just like, they're all just flocking to him. And we leave out the part with the whip and the temple and the, like there's a little bit of that, We leave out the part where he says things like brood of vipers, which you don't ever use, but it's kind of like a cut down with a bite. Like it's probably a stretch to say that he was swearing, and probably not at all a stretch to say that he was using ridiculously strong language to communicate something to these people as he called them hypocrites, right? Like our view of Jesus gets saturated in one of these kind of things. I grew up in churches sometimes that were so grace-focused, which is great, but at the end of the day, it was so much about that Jesus, to be really blunt, he was so soft, I feel like I could beat him up, right? That's how I felt. That's how I really felt. And then I grew up in other churches that they only talked about, like, it was all this. You know what I'm talking about? You ever been in a church like that? Where it's like everything was just, he was just angry all the time. I don't know what he's so mad about. Like he was always angry. And who he was angry at? Everybody but me, And he was angry at everybody but the guy teaching, Like it was like constant like anger. And what happens with our caricatures of Jesus is that oftentimes we paint him as either or, right? Jesus is either grace or he's truth. Jesus is either the nicest, kindest, huggable little Teletubby that you've ever seen, or he's mad at everything, turn or burn, hands of an angry God, it's all going to fall apart, and if you sin one more time, or if you have one more lustful thought, like anything like that, not you in general, I wasn't pointing at anybody that could have got real weird, right? Camera, you get it. Then it's that. And so I put it in my notes. I was writing this part of it a little bit more last night. I was thinking this is as blunt as I know how to say it. That's this. Our interpretation, but often unintentional manipulation of the person of Jesus is often driven by our own desires and specifically our own agenda, right? This is most characterizations that you see of Jesus. And you see this in both directions. You do. A lot of times you hear about Jesus being only about justice and only about the kind of reconciliation that dominates the person who is the offender without ever experiencing grace in the castaway. People don't say it out loud, but that is the posture towards that. Or it's so much grace that it ignores, I don't miss this, it ignores the broken relationships that are caused by the actions of people who do wrong. As if Jesus were blind to pain. As if Jesus didn't have the same sort of perspective that I would have around my kids. I might forgive you, but if you hurt my kids, it's a different thing, right? And we like to paint Jesus as either or. And then what people often do, and you see this especially on social media, right? People often weaponize their incomplete view of Jesus to exercise their own agenda for the world. And come on, you know this, and I know this. I do this. Where I will leverage a view of Jesus to weaponize it in a way to where the world becomes what I think the world should be. And I'm going to miss this. In that moment of emotion. And pastors like me, we're good at this, right? We're good at this. People that talk about Jesus are good at this. People who tweet about this are good about this. Your uncle at the dinner table, you know this. We talk about gotcha statements. People have gotcha statements all day long on either direction that end the conversation around one side or the other. And so I'll tell you what we're going to do today. It's going to be very, very simple. We're going to look at an area of the Bible called John. John's one of my favorite places to look at in the Bible, mostly because John encapsulates some of the emotional part of the gospel, right? So John teaches about things that, he talks about the events, but he talks about the things that are happening around the events as well as he documents it. But he starts out this essential letter, he starts this out in a way where he describes who Jesus is. Now, you can read this, and honestly, for most people who read the beginning of John, it's kind of one of those things, you skip real quick to 3:16, right? You kind of skip the first part. It's a lot of theology, and then it's and then God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten. We read that, underline it, star it, circle it, memorize it, and teach it to our kids, which is great. I'm a big fan of that one. But what leads up to all that is some of the most rich, powerful, and overlooked theology around who the person of Jesus actually is and who we're to model our life after, right? So we're going to pick up in John. This is John chapter 1. It says this. It says, in the beginning was, can we say this together? In the beginning was the Word, right? So this is interesting. Now, this is one of those things that's fascinating. A lot of people, especially Christian teachers, only attribute this to theology around Christianity. The idea here is word, specifically like logos, but this was an idea that also permeated some of the ancient Roman culture as well. The idea around this is that there was logic and grace kind of within the logic that permeated the world. So in the beginning was the Word, but it's actually talking about the person of Jesus before the human of Jesus existed in this way or this form in the world, right? So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was with God in the beginning, and through him, and I don't miss this, so easy to miss this, so powerful, through him all things were made. So through this person of the Word, specifically we're talking about Jesus, we'll get there in a second, all things flowed, all things were made, right? So if you can think about this, I started following some of these space accounts on Twitter. I think it's so fascinating that where it is so interesting. It talks about in the beginning, if there was nothing and then there was something. I always, for years and years, just thought it was like a linear thing. You know what I mean? Just like one line. But the better example of this was in the beginning, and it was the Word, everything gets created, and it doesn't just go as a line. It goes out and like this, right? So if you were to study what happens in space, what happens in our universe, it wasn't just one thread that goes out. It's almost like the infinite time and space just expands out on in, right? In the beginning, it was created this way. All things were made, and without him, nothing was made that has been made. And this is a powerful theological statement that essentially, through the Word, through Jesus, through this, all of it was created, and none of it would be created except through him. And it goes on and it says this, and it says, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, here's what I'm going to say here is so fascinating to me. Again, I'm a little bit of a Bible nerd. I think it's fascinating. The original readers on the first pass would have been looking at this not through a lens of light and dark, good or bad. These images were used to describe different things like this throughout. But what John's about to do is lift that thinking and then actually compare it to light and dark as he begins to talk about Jesus over the course of this. Light and darkness, and the darkness has not overcome the Word through Jesus. And it says this, the true light that gives light to everyone, was coming into the world, and he was in the world, and through the world and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. And this is one of the most fascinating things as you read through the New Testament. It gives really almost like a summary of a lot of the interaction with Jesus here. That even Jesus' close followers, so don't miss this, attached their view and agenda to who they thought the Savior of the world should be. Right? A lot of people who were following Jesus closely, a lot of people who were looking for like release or this sort of military-esque leader to come and save them as had happened in the past, they had attached that agenda, and then Jesus comes and upends all of that with his language around new kingdom, the ways that it seeming like handed himself over, humility in these ways. The world didn't recognize him, and it goes on. And he came to that which was his own, but his own did not even receive him, right? Did not receive him. Then it goes on, it says this. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right, and can we say this together? He gave the right to become children of God. Now, this is one of those fascinating things that scholars debate for a long time. I grew up, anybody remember the song Friend of God? Do you remember this? Yeah, I'm a friend of God. You say it over and over and over again. Which is great. It's a beautiful picture. But in John, and specifically the New Testament, for those people who come into faith in Jesus, I don't want you to miss this. It said they're reborn as new beings in the world. They become children of God, which is fascinating because it gives access, right? This is kind of one of the theses of the New Testament. It gives access to the power and the presence of who Jesus is to move people beyond sin, beyond the chains that sin would have for them, and to be in the world in a completely different way as children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. And then we get the picture, which is a very interesting, like Trinitarian discussion. If you're, again, a little bit of a Bible geek like I am, it says this. The Word then becomes flesh. And this is the part that's so fascinating as we talk about Jesus, because there's a conversation around Jesus in that he always was, and he was in the present, and then he always will be. And so this word becomes flesh and made his dwelling among us. That God came down in human form and experienced the world, and don't miss this, as you and I experienced the world. This is one of the claims of Christianity that becomes so fascinating when you get into like the deeper parts of it. Because the things that frustrate you would probably frustrate him, like ripping tags off of pillows. You know what I mean? Like the things that bother you would have likely bothered him. The temptations that you have, we have this whole section that talks about the temptations of Jesus. They're not like distant, like God's fighting kind of temptation. This is temptation that humanity experiences. The Word became flesh, and he dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. And then he says this phrase, full of grace and truth. And this is the part that's so fascinating, right? This is the part that's so easy to miss. This is one of those lines that honestly you could read this for years and years and years and miss this like beautiful thing that describes the power of Jesus, and that's this. That he's not one or the other, and he doesn't have a bent. He's full of both. Now, John and many people in John's audience, they would have been pretty well versed in some of the ancient teachings of these ancient Jewish people and the stories around this, the narratives around this. And so there's almost like a cross-reference for John here. And the area of the Bible that a lot of people think he's probably pulling some of this from is in Exodus. And some of you know the Exodus story. What's so fascinating about this, to give you the short version of it, is Moses has this moment where he like asks God to like reveal himself and pass before him, right? And so he's like, hey, I want to see your glory. I want to see the tangible expression of your presence. So I'm just going to read this one small part to give you a glimpse, but here's what it says. It says essentially that, and he, being the Lord, passed in front of Moses proclaiming this, right? The Lord, or really, we talked about this for a long time. More bluntly, the one that you have submitted to and will continue to come under, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love. And so far to this point, it sounds like a great love song from Delilah, right? If you know, right? Delilah. All right, anyway, so, yeah. And then the last one is this, is faithfulness. Now, you read this in the English text, and faithfulness sounds like I'm committed to you, and that's great, and it's just sweet, and it continues the song, right? And you have all of these descriptions of grace and love. But the word faithfulness here has such rich context that goes beyond this kind of love analogy. Right? It's written in Hebrew. The two words that we get here are hesed, right? And then met. We're going to talk about this for a second. The love portion of this, right, we'll put this up here, is like steadfast love. It's mercy, specifically covenant love. God is committed to this group of people, asks for their commitment back. It's covenant love. The faithfulness side of this is truth. And then the faithfulness component of it that's kind of gritty is based in some ways on action. What do you do? And how do you do it? So in love and faithfulness, you get this. The love part of this is all hugs and great and we're all happy. The faithfulness part about this has to do with the fullness of how you act and respond in the world. So essentially saying this, that God has this fullness of the love component and also the fullness of the faithfulness teeth component to this as well. And it's not either or. And then John continues in his letter and he says this. He says, out of the fullness that we have all received grace in place of grace already given, which the text here is so fun in the original language, but essentially it's like grace upon grace upon grace upon grace. It's almost like this infinite sort of grace. And then he gives kind of the context from a little bit of what we were just referencing, but he says this, for the law was given through Moses, and grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Right? And here's why this is so important. When it says grace and truth came from Jesus Christ, what we see here is that the fullness of this may have existed throughout all of eternity. But in our world, in the most tangible way possible, in the ways that we get to model our life and see what we should be in the world. Don't miss this. It's not grace or truth. It's not any sort of balancing act. It's to model our lives after Jesus as he modeled for us the fullness of grace and truth. Now, when we think about justice, and this happens from the time that we were like little kids, I remember like seeing movies early on. Anybody remember when you saw your first rated R movie? Anybody remember this? Anybody? Some of you have never seen it. Noah's never seen rated R. I'm sorry, I'm done with the joke. I love him so much. I owe you a steak dinner after all this, man. I really do. No, you get it. Now, R-rated movies, you get it. The first R-rated movie I ever saw was Air Force One. Anybody ever seen Air Force One with Harrison Ford? You remember this? I'll never forget. If you've never seen it, I'm about to ruin the movie for you, so you deserve it since it came out in like 95. All right, here we go. The end of the movie, right? He's the president. He's on the plane. They hijack his plane. You remember this? At the end of the movie, he like ties the guy up. You remember this? And every guy in the room knows exactly what I'm talking about. He ties him up. And you remember what he says? You remember what he says? Yeah, he did. Everybody lowers their voice when you say it, too. You know what I mean? Get off my plane. You know what I mean? And you see, like, the look in Gary Oldman's eyes, who's, like, done terrible things the whole time. And then he, like, kicks him, the parachute opens up, and bye-bye, Gary. You know, like, that's the end of it. Now, I'll never forget this. I was pretty young when I saw this movie, like 6. I'm just kidding. It wasn't. I was older. But I remember looking at my mom, and I'll never forget this. I'll never forget saying, man, he deserved that, right? You ever felt that? You ever been in a movie you felt that? Like, he got what was coming. Yeah, you know, there's a little bit of that. And I'll never forget, she kind of looked at me funny because I think she really liked Harrison Ford in that movie. A lot more than I did. Anyway. And I thought, it's almost like, it felt like you did this, so you should get this, right? Like, that's a little bit of what we're talking about. You get this, you see this. You see the scales of justice. Remember this? This is always interesting. That they should feel, no, come on, they should feel balanced. There's a little bit of this, where there's a little bit like it should feel balanced. And we're taught this a lot. We're taught this a lot. So if you think about it, if you do one thing on one side, essentially there should be some sort of consequence on the other side that levels the scales of balance. Now, what's interesting about this is I also believe in our structural systems around law, all these kinds of things for sure. But when we're talking about a theological approach to how we treat people and are in the world, and don't miss this, The eye for an eye thing doesn't work when it comes to the ways that Jesus lived. It just doesn't. If you did the thing, then you should get essentially an equal response. It's hard. It doesn't really work in this way. And here's why. Because most of us crave this for other people, but would never crave it for ourselves. And if you're a parent in the room and you know this, the thing that you crave for your kids if they were to get into trouble in this way, right, isn't that it would be equal. What would you crave? You would crave that one side would bend towards grace, right? There's something about us that when it comes to people that we love and care about, we want to bend it towards grace. And when people that we're distant from, it bends often the other way. I think this is so interesting because often the ways that we teach about grace and truth, and don't miss this, seem like they are so at odds with each other that they can't exist together, or that one has to be balanced out with the others. But the teaching of the New Testament, now please don't miss this, is never one or the other. The teaching of the New Testament is kind of like this. I had to ask my wife how to mix these colors. I was like, what makes green again? Because I should go back to kindergarten, right? But imagine if we were going to mix the two together. You have grace and you have truth. The best representation of who Jesus was in the world, now don't miss this, is a combination of both and the fullness of both. Now, here's why this matters so much, and this is why this matters so much in our world, is that anytime we work to bend one or the other, anytime that we elevate one or the other in these ways, but please don't miss this, you miss the fullness of both. Now, let me say what some of you are thinking. Ready? If you're like me, this is what you're thinking, because I'm skeptical of anybody who has a microphone that teaches us, especially on this kind of stuff. Let me say, you are looking at this, and if you've been through the lens of truth, you're low-key pissed. I get it. You get it. And if you've been towards grace, you're a little bit like, well, that sounds sweet, because you hadn't thought about how much I've talked about the truth side so far, which is great too, right? There's a little bit of that. So let me tell you 100% what I'm not saying, is that justice should not be, because it should be. And accountability 100% should be. And responsibility should 100% be there. In fact, as you read through the New Testament, come on, you don't find Jesus just brushing over accountability. You find him directing it at certain people who the accountability and responsibility should shift their hearts in a new and different direction. And then you find Jesus extending grace. Put in my notes instead of this way, that Jesus is the embodiment of the fullness of grace and truth. It's both. It's both. Now, some of you in the room, if you're really honest and you're like me, you're going, that sounds really great and very preachery. And in what ways does that actually play out with people who have hurt you, or who have hurt people that you love, or have done things to you where it feels like people got let off the hook and things didn't go the way that you thought it should? And I'll tell you, I think it has so much more to do with your posture in the world and towards people than it even does with even the choice that sometimes we make. And here's what I mean by that. There's a piece of our hearts when we bend one way or the other that bend us so heavily in a direction that I think, and you know this, that I end up taking the opposite emotional response to certain things as a person who is filled with Jesus should take. And the prayer that I think, and this is what I wish everybody who's a follower of Jesus would pray consistently, is this: that Jesus, let me model my life around the life that you modeled for me. That I wouldn't choose either or, that I would choose kind of this both and sort of thing. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of the ways that I think we do this, and at the end, I'm going to do my best to kind of tie a bow and how this works practically for us. But the first thing is this: I think we have to work really hard to reject any either or thinking when it comes to grace and truth, right? Now, you are human and I am human, so my immediate response is typically one or the other, right? If it's someone who hurts one of my kids, it's 100% duh. If it's one of my kids, it's usually the other side of it, right? That's just the way that works. But the thing that I think sort of outlines what this should be is a countercultural approach to this whole thing. And the countercultural approach to holding both of those things together in the fullness of both of them causes us oftentimes to be criticized for not ever being enough on one side or the other. Now, here's what I mean by that. Ready? If you come down hard on one side of justice or truth or these kinds of things, you know that? And then at the same time say, and also I hope for and believe for and am working towards the redemption of the person who's the offender, right? I don't miss this. You will likely be criticized for the grace side of it from people who are pulling hard only on truth. And if, on the other side of it, you go, you know what, I lean into the grace stuff, and I also want people to experience the accountability to it, but people who are primarily bending on the grace side will say that might feel too harsh or too much, or you shouldn't have done it that way. Absolutely. Those kinds of things cause tension, and I'll tell you this is how I think that you know you're doing it well to some degree. If you're frustrating both sides of this argument just enough, then likely you will continually be criticized for holding both of those things in tandem with each other. Because when you do that, it will never quite be enough for somebody who's bending one or the other directions. Some of you are married, now you know this, some of you are married to somebody, you know this, where they've been one way and you've been the other. Come on, you know this. And when this happens, there's a tension and a pull because one of you is not enough on one side or the other than the other person. I'm just telling you. When you find yourself wading through the tension of this, you have found yourself moving in the right direction. If you never experience tension around this, please don't miss this, you're likely bent one way or the other. Put in my notes, the second thing is this. I think you work towards pursuing accountability, justice, and responsibility. And this is what it looks like. With predetermined grace. Now, every person that probably, I'm more bent on the truth, justice side of things. I don't know if you knew that or not. Yep. Enneagram 8s unite. It's great. So here's the thing about this, and don't miss this. The predetermined grace, I immediately want to answer the question, what does that mean? And if you're anything like me and that's your first thing that pops in your head, this is a great talk for you, right? I'm just telling you. If there's a part of you that goes, but how much grace should I extend? To what degree do I extend the grace? But they did and you have I get it, I have the list too, I get it. To what degree do I extend grace? I'm not even going to answer the question for you. I'm just going to tell you this. The fact that the question exists and continues to bubble up, don't miss this, tells you something about the posture that you need to pay attention to in your heart. Now, that doesn't mean you don't set boundaries. Absolutely. It doesn't mean that there are some relationships you don't need to be a part of. Absolutely. I'm not saying any of those things. What I'm saying, though, is if the thing that bubbles up in you is, to what extent do I extend grace? Then there is likely something, don't miss this, there's likely something in you that doesn't want to extend it. And that, now don't miss this, that is not what Jesus came to bring into the world. Jesus came to redeem the world and bring the fullness of redemption to it. And it is possible for those things to exist together. Now, the other side of this, and I'll say this, some of you, when it comes to this sort of thing, it's hard for you to lean into the justice side of it because you're so grace-filled, it's hard for you to even hold somebody accountable because what you want more than anything else, ready, is peace. You want peace with people. You want peace with the world. You want everybody to feel good and hug. You love Jesus holding a lamb doing this. That's great. Like, you're all about it. Yeah, how he loves us, including Bert, the lamb. I don't know why Bert felt right. Like, there's a little bit of that. That's great. And what you don't like is not that there's a lack of peace. Please don't miss this. This is you. Come on, don't miss this. What you don't like is the uncomfortable nature of tension. And what Jesus has called us into is tension. There is no like, and then I give my life to Christ and look at me just sailing. Like, it just feels easy. It's like marriage. You got married not because you were looking for peace. I mean, maybe you were, but then you found out week 2. You know what I mean? You smell funny. You know what I mean? Like, there's a little bit of that. No one in my house smells. That is not what I'm saying. I love you. It's not. It is, yeah. Except for my son after baseball practice. That's true. All right, it's not that. But come on. What you don't want is tension. And I think this, if that's you, the best thing that you could do is get yourself in the middle of the tension and acknowledge, and please don't miss this, acknowledge that that's the thing that you don't like, and that needs to be shaved off of you. Now, for the other set of you who've been towards the truth, justice, like me, let me say this real quick. A couple thoughts. First thing is this, and I wish I could convince everybody of this. Not every personal battle is yours to engage with, right? You ready? I don't know how that works. This took years of counseling for me to recognize that just because you offended me doesn't mean I have to explain myself. All right? Just because I'm upset about it doesn't mean you have to know how upset I am about it. And just because that I'm frustrated doesn't mean that I have to solve this problem with all of my words and win. You know, like that's just a piece of, like, not every personal battle is yours to engage with. I'm going to teach you this is amazing. This is worth the whole thing of the talk. Ready? Sometimes you just don't have to say anything. Not all the time. But there are times that you smile and you think, great, I appreciate that you didn't like my socks. You know what I mean? Like whatever that is. I'm just telling you, not every personal thing is yours to engage with. Now let me say this to some of you, right? This is the other part. Not every systemic battle is yours to engage with. Now, I'm going to come back in a second. We'll talk more about it. Let me just say this, and here's why this matters. Some of you are wired to engage with systemic problems in really powerful ways. The problem is that if you pick too many to engage with, you never engage with them well. So if you get frustrated at every systemic problem and feel like you will be a contribution to that solution with everyone, you just get tired and you stop being good at all of them. And what you're doing is you're just frustrated. And you know how you know if you're frustrated? Because you feel frustrated all the time. You know what I mean? Like you can't sleep, you keep shopping. Everything is a thing. But it's not even, you don't even know the people. Like it's all, come on. Not every systemic thing is a problem for you to be a part of solving. I put in my notes to say it this way, right? I wish I could convince everybody of this. Some battles, though, are yours to engage with, and they don't just like invite you to. They require you to show up with a fullness of grace and truth. Some things matter to you in a way where you have to show up for it. But if you show up to every one of them, please don't miss this, you look a little foolish because you're not educated on all of them. You look a little foolish because you just look angry at all of them. And come on, here's a secret. Don't tell anybody else. Let's just keep this between us and online audience, whatever. Come on. The angry posture rarely makes the long-term systemic changes that sometimes we think. Come on, you ready? You want to know how to be angry and be good at it? You ready? Don't tell anybody. Be angry and nice and get it done. I'm just going to tell you, there's a piece of this that's just like, one of the most powerful things I've ever heard anybody talk about this. It was Taylor Swift. Are you ready? Because she's great. Taylor Swift said this. I love it. She goes, when I was younger, I would get mad in rehearsals, and I'd be frustrated and I would just yell at all people. And then she goes, then I realized that if I could communicate it in a way, and don't miss this, that was persuasive, everybody liked me at the end, and we got more done faster. So I'm just going to, this wasn't even my notes. I'm just telling you, when you figure out your handful of things that you were put here to solve, and you invest your energy and time into doing it well, and not just angry, and you are persuasive about it, please don't miss this, then you begin to see progress in the thing that you were created to be a part of the solution with. And the danger is that we have been conditioned to believe that simply because we have a platform, we get to communicate consistently about things that we don't really know anything about. But the things that you should know about, you should know them so well. The things that matter to you, that break your heart, that the solution has to be there. And if you were to tell 10 people, they wouldn't all say the same. They wouldn't all feel it like you do, but you feel it. Come on. That thing in you, the world needs you to show up with wisdom and the kind of posture that actually moves change. forward. And the last thing is this, and we'll wrap up. In all of this, when it comes to grace and truth, I think the best indicator of where your heart is what you feel in these moments, right? So I put it in my notes. It's like you monitor where joy and grief come from. And this is one of those weird things that happens for many of us. That happens to me all the time, and I try to pay attention to it. I said this earlier, but sometimes the opposite emotion comes up in a situation that it shouldn't, right? So I put it in my notes, and I said this. If you only find joy from the justice or truth side of this, you may be missing grace. Now, here's what I mean by this. If there's a piece of your heart that slightly smirks when Gary Oldman, get off my, and he goes, there's a piece of you that, like me, there's a piece of you like that. It's like they got it and they was coming to them. You don't ever say that because you're smarter than that. But what you feel is the slight internal micro pleasure of joy that they got it, right? And it doesn't break your heart and you don't experience any grief around this. Please don't miss it. There's a part of your heart that might be holding on to that too tightly. All right, put it on the other side. I said it this way, right? If you ever find grief in grace and redemption, then you're likely postured from revenge and bitterness. And here's what I mean by that. And this is the internal thing that's hard. Come on, and nobody ever talks about it. But if you feel sad when someone else moves through a redemptive thing, if there's a part of you, I think, that grieves someone moving through accountability and responsibility and then coming full circle to experience grace and redemption. Like there are pieces of this, come on. And your response internally is a sadness or a grief that someone experienced redemption. And come on, it may be that lurking somewhere in your heart is a form of bitterness and revenge that you have to wrestle down. Now, let me give a caveat to this. There are times that people experience a fake version of redemption and grace, and that's not what I'm talking about. There are times where things get ignored and pushed under the rug, and it just seems like somebody immediately gets elevated. That's not what I'm talking about. But if someone has moved through the process and they get full circle, and at some point there's a component of their life that experiences redemption and grace, and your response is grief or anger, some version of that. And don't miss this. And what's lurking oftentimes in the back of our hearts is a version of this that wanted revenge all along. Now, let me say one more thing that's controversial because I haven't done that at all so far today. It'll be great. Let me say this. The real honest truth of this is that sometimes we want revenge. And sometimes we want people to get what's coming to them, for sure. Me too, 100%. But I think what we miss, and this is where the teaching of the New Testament is so powerful on, is that thing doesn't grip the other person. It grips you. The internal desire for the revenge thing we think is projected at people. But what it is an internal grip of the heart that doesn't let go. And some of you, come on, let's just be really honest. Some of you in the room, and this is my story too. Some of you are angry at the out there kind of thing of people, more because you want revenge for the person who hurt you 10 years ago. And you're just taking big, long swings at somebody who can't actually hurt you back because you've never dealt with whatever's right here. And that's why at the end of the day, come on, when someone out there experiences some form of redemption, you feel sadness because it wasn't that you didn't even want redemption for them. It was that this person never got what was coming to them. It was that this person never moved through that circle of redemption and grace and got all the way through it from accountability, responsibility to the other side. You're frustrated here and you take it out up there. And so here's the honest truth, ready? This is just true. You can do that thing all day long. And that thing may be a boss, maybe a spouse, maybe a family member. It could be so many different things. You can do that all day long. But you will never make the kind of change in the world based off of that kind of anger that you could make if you process this thing and then move forward to change the world. The fullness of grace. grace and truth. And if you're a follower of Jesus, the honest part about this is you don't get to decide. You don't get to pick, am I going to bend one way or the other? You come into this and you say, Jesus, you have called me to both. Yeah, put it in my notes that said this. Right. Followers of Jesus practice grace and truth. They don't practice one or the other. And so I'm going to tell you, for that person who you want the justice thing for so bad, I'm just telling you, at the end of the day, when you get to the place where you want the justice thing and the grace thing together, come on, that's when you know you're moving in the direction that you should. When you get to the point in your life where you go like, I want both for the person, that's when you get to the place where you recognize like I am moving in the direction that Jesus has called me to move.